The rain did not wash the alley clean. It only stirred up the stench of rotting cardboard and damp earth. I backed into the brick wall, the rough surface scraping against my bruised shoulder blades. The metallic taste of blood was heavy on my tongue. 3 local enforcers had cornered me. At 23, after 8 years of surviving the concrete grid since running from the state orphanage, I knew the rhythm of a street beating. You protect your head, you take the hits to your ribs, and you wait for them to get tired. I tightened my jaw, preparing for the inevitable impact. Then, the rhythm broke. A figure stepped into the narrow, suffocating space of the alley. She did not belong here. Even in the dim light of the flickering street lamp, her posture was a striking vertical line, defying the slump of the surrounding decay. She wore a tailored trench coat, and the faint, crisp scent of gardenias cut through the smell of wet garbage and rust. She did not scream for help. She did not hesitate. She walked directly between the raised baseball bat and my face. She turned her back to the men, facing me, entirely exposing herself to the threat. "Leave," she commanded, her voice not loud, but carrying an icy, unwavering authority that echoed off the damp bricks. She raised a phone, the screen brightly displaying an active call to the precinct, reciting the exact street coordinates and the physical descriptions of the men without a tremor in her breath. The thugs hesitated, muttered a string of curses, and backed away into the shadows. She knelt in the mud, indifferent to the grime staining her immaculate coat. Her hand reached out, hovering just an inch from my bruised cheek before she carefully, gently grasped my wrist. It was not a grip of force, but an anchor. "Stand up," she said quietly. I looked at her, at the severe bun of dark hair, the sharp, elegant lines of her face, and the complete lack of pity in her eyes. Pity I would have spat at. But this was something else. I let her pull me out of the dark. Her apartment felt like a sensory deprivation tank. The floors were pale, polished hardwood. The walls were a stark, unforgiving white. Large windows overlooked a city I usually only saw from the gutters. I stood in the center of her living room, mud and rainwater dripping from my torn jeans, feeling like a stray dog that had accidentally wandered into a museum. She handed me a thick, clean towel and pointed to the bathroom. "Hot water. Take your time. There are clean clothes on the counter." I did not thank her. I locked the bathroom door, leaning against it, listening for the sound of a phone dialing or the heavy footsteps of a trap closing. In my world, no one offered a warm bed without expecting a pound of flesh in return. I showered quickly, the hot water stinging my cuts, and put on the oversized gray sweatpants she had left. They smelled of expensive detergent and safety. It made my skin crawl. When I stepped out, she was sitting at the kitchen island, placing a bowl of hot soup on the counter. I sat opposite her, keeping my posture defensive, my eyes scanning the exits. "I am Naomi," she said, watching me eat. "And you have the bone structure of a dancer. The arch of your foot, the line of your neck. It is wasted on concrete." I stopped the spoon halfway to my mouth. A bitter laugh scraped up my throat. "I'm a stray, not a swan. If you want a pet, buy a dog." She did not flinch at my hostility. She simply poured herself a glass of water. "I am a professional ballet dancer. I have an empty guest room. You can stay here off the streets and eat my food. In exchange, you will come to the studio with me. You will learn the discipline of the bar. You will learn how to stand." I stared at her, searching for the lie. It sounded absurd, but the soup was hot, and my ribs were throbbing. I nodded once, a silent, temporary surrender, deciding I would sleep in her guest room tonight and figure out how to escape her trap tomorrow. The trap revealed itself 3 days later. The studio was a massive expanse of mirrors and scuffed pine floors. I stood in the corner, awkwardly tugging at the tight black leotard Naomi had provided. I felt exposed, ridiculous. She was at the front of the room, adjusting the height of the bar, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Then I saw it. Tucked in the far corner, angled perfectly toward the center of the floor, was a heavy-duty tripod holding a high-end camera, surrounded by a ring light. A cold, heavy stone settled in my stomach. The puzzle pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Naomi was somewhat famous. I had seen her face on flyers outside the theater district. She was building a narrative. The tragic street girl, saved by the benevolent, graceful artist. The ultimate charity project for social media clout. I was not a student. I was a prop. I was content for her digital halo. "Position 1, Naomi called out, unaware of the sudden ice freezing my veins. I walked to the bar. I placed my hand on the smooth wood. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, bruised, guarded, rough, and then at hers, pristine, celebrated, fake. I swallowed the venom building in my throat. If she wanted to play the savior, I would make her work for it. I decided I would stay. I would take her food, her shelter, her clean clothes, and I would despise her every single second of it. Ballet was not a dance. It was an organized, beautiful torture. Every muscle fiber in my body, hardened by years of surviving the cold, rebelled against the unnatural rotation of the hips, the agonizing stretch of the Achilles. My toes blistered, cracked, and bled. The pain was sharp and constant, far worse than the blunt force of a fist. And Naomi was a tyrant wrapped in silk. She did not yell. She did not insult me. She simply demanded perfection with a quiet, devastating persistence. Again, she would say, tapping my misaligned shoulder. Your center is entirely lost. Find it. I hated her. I hated her calm voice. I hated the way she never seemed to sweat while I was gasping for air on the floor. I began a silent, vicious rebellion. When she instructed me to hold an arabesque, I would intentionally drop my knee. When she told me to point my toes, I would sickle my foot, ruining the line. I wanted to break her composure. I wanted the camera in the corner to capture her frustration, to force her to drop the angelic mask and show the ugly, selfish reality I was certain hid underneath. But she never snapped. She would walk over, kneel beside my shaking legs, and physically correct my posture, her hands firm and steady. If you want to fall, fall. But do not pretend you cannot stand, she murmured once, her eyes locking onto mine through the mirror. The observation was too piercing, too accurate. It only fueled my rage. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening. The rain was lashing against the high studio windows, mirroring the storm brewing in my chest. I had failed a simple pirouette for the dozenth time, my ankle giving out, sending me crashing hard against the floorboards. Naomi walked over, extending a hand to help me up. I slapped it away. I pushed myself up, my breathing ragged, my fists clenched. I walked over to the corner, grabbed the heavy tripod, and slammed it down onto the floor. The camera clattered against the wood. Is this what you want? I screamed, the sound tearing through the quiet studio. Is this good footage? Street rat fails again. Saintly dancer shows endless patience. Go ahead, post it. Tell your followers how hard it is to train a wild animal. Naomi stood entirely still. She looked at the fallen camera, then back at me. Her expression was unreadable, a blank canvas that infuriated me more than a slap would have. You think I don't know what this is? I spat, stepping closer to her, trying to force a reaction. You don't care about me. You care about how I make you look. You're a plastic saint. You brought me here to polish your own halo. You're no better than the people on the street. You just hide your hustle behind classical music and a smile. The silence that followed was suffocating. I waited for her to point to the door. I waited to be thrown back into the rain. Instead, Naomi walked past me. She picked up the tripod. She carefully checked the camera lens. Then she walked to the stereo and turned off the music. Class is dismissed, she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. She did not look at me as she gathered her bag. She walked out, leaving me alone in the vast, mirrored room. I stared at my reflection. I had won the argument. I had shattered the illusion. So, why did I feel entirely, overwhelmingly empty? The atmosphere in the apartment became a heavy, frozen lake. We existed in the same space, but we did not speak. She continued to cook for me. She continued to leave clean towels by the door. Her silent persistence felt like a slow punishment. A few days later, I was walking back from a rare trip to the grocery store when I saw them. Across the street from the studio entrance, leaning against a rusted sedan. The men from the alley. They were smoking, their eyes scanning the entrance. They had tracked me. I owed a debt to their boss, an old remnant of my street survival, and they were here to collect. I ducked behind a parked van, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew this world. Violence was a contagion. It spread to anyone standing too close. If they found me here, they would ruin the studio. They would ruin Naomi. I sneaked through the back alley, avoiding the main doors, and slipped into the apartment. I pulled my battered duffel bag from under the guest bed. I threw my few ragged clothes inside. I did not pack the clean sweatpants. I did not pack the ballet shoes. I belonged to the dirt, and I was going back to it before the dirt could stain her pristine floors. I convinced myself she would be relieved. I was saving her the trouble of evicting her failed project. Before I left, A dark, twisted impulse seized me. I wanted to sever the tie completely. I wanted to make sure there was no coming back, no room for regret. I walked into her bedroom. Draped over the chair was the costume for her upcoming principal role, a magnificent, delicate tutu, layers of white tulle hand-stitched with silver thread. It represented everything she was: fragile, expensive, untouchable. My hands shook as I grabbed the fabric. I pulled. The sound of tearing tulle was loud in the silent apartment. I ripped the top layer, a jagged, ugly wound in the perfect white. I dropped it on the floor and walked to the living room, sitting on the sofa with my duffel bag, waiting for her to return. I wanted her to hate me. I needed her to hate me, so I could leave without looking back. The lock clicked. Naomi walked in. She saw me sitting with my bag. She didn't say a word. She walked into her bedroom. I held my breath, waiting for the scream, the crash, the final explosion. Footsteps approached. Naomi stood in the doorway, holding the torn tutu. Her face was pale. She traced the jagged edge of the tear with a slow, deliberate finger. She did not yell. She sat down on the armchair opposite me. She placed the ruined costume carefully on her lap. She looked up at me, and in her eyes, I saw no anger. Only a profound, bottomless sorrow. A quiet devastation that stripped away every defense I had ever built. "If this is what it takes for you to feel safe," she whispered, her voice wavering just slightly, "then tear the rest of it. But I am not letting you walk back into that alley." I sat frozen. My armor cracked, splintered, and shattered. I could not fight someone who refused to raise their fists. I dropped my gaze to the floor, my hands gripping my knees until my knuckles turned white. I did not leave that night. The confrontation with my past could not be delayed. It was late, past midnight. I had gone to the studio alone to punish myself, drilling the same pirouette until my feet bled, trying to outrun the guilt of a torn dress. The building was supposed to be secure, but the heavy thud against the back exit door proved otherwise. The lock gave way, with a screech of metal. 3 men stepped into the shadows of the studio. The leader tapped a heavy steel pipe against his palm. I retreated, my back hitting the cold glass of the mirrors. I scanned the room for a weapon. Nothing but smooth wood and air. I braced myself. "Time to go home, little bird," the leader sneered, stepping onto the pristine dance floor with muddy boots. Suddenly, the main doors burst open. The overhead fluorescent lights snapped on, blindingly bright. Naomi stood in the doorway. She was breathing hard, having clearly run from the apartment. "Get out," she said, her voice a whip cracking through the silence. The men laughed. The leader swung the pipe idly. "Mind your business, lady. We're just taking out the trash." He lunged toward me. I closed my eyes, but the impact never hit me. A sickening, heavy crack echoed through the vast room, followed by a sharp intake of breath that wasn't mine. I opened my eyes. Naomi had thrown herself entirely between me and the metal pipe. She was on her knees, her left arm hanging at an unnatural, horrifying angle. The steel had caught her mid-forearm. Her face was drained of all color, chalk white under the harsh lights. Yet she did not scream. With her good arm, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and hit a button. The loud, blaring sound of an active police dispatch operator filled the room. 3 males, Naomi gasped out, her voice tight with excruciating pain, yet terrifyingly steady. "Armed with deadly weapons. Assault in progress. I have their faces on the studio security cameras. Dispatch immediately." The mention of cameras and the immediate response from the phone panicked the men. They cursed, dropped the pipe, and scrambled out the broken back door, vanishing into the night. Naomi slumped sideways against the mirror. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands hovering over her broken arm, terrified to touch her, terrified to breathe. "Naomi," I choked out, panic constricting my throat. She slowly turned her head. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her eyes, clouded with pain, scanned my face, my shoulders, my arms. Did they hit you?" she whispered. "No," I sobbed, the sound tearing violently from my chest. "No, you idiot. Why did you do that? Your arm." "You're safe," she murmured, her eyes fluttering shut as she leaned her head back against the glass. "That's all that matters." The hospital waiting room was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial bleach. I sat in a hard plastic chair, staring at the dried mud and small specks of blood on my sneakers. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the sound of the steel hitting her bone. A doctor in blue scrubs finally walked out. I stood up, my legs numb. She has a compound fracture of the radius and ulna, the doctor said, his tone professional, detached. We've set the bones, but it's a severe break. The nerve damage is significant. When can she dance again? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The doctor sighed, looking down at his clipboard. Ballet requires immense upper body tension, partnering lifting. With this level of trauma, her career as a principal dancer is highly compromised. She may never perform professionally at that level again. The word struck me harder than any fist ever had. I collapsed back into the chair. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. A principal dancer. She was at the peak of her career. She had sacrificed her life's work, her entire identity, for a stray dog who had ruined her costumes and insulted her character. Nobody looking for social media likes takes a steel pipe to the arm. Nobody seeking clout sacrifices their future for a stranger. The realization crashed over me, suffocating and absolute. I was a monster, and she was the only real thing I had ever encountered. They kept her for observation. I returned to the apartment to pack a bag with her essentials. The space felt hollow, without her quiet presence. I walked into her study to find her insurance card. I opened the top drawer of her desk. There was no PR strategy. There were no social media content plans. Instead, I found a thick, manila folder. The name on the tab was mine, Violet. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a completed application to the National Conservatory of Classical Arts, one of the most prestigious prep schools in the country. There were medical clearance forms she had filled out for me, with every detail of my injuries and recovery carefully documented. There was a receipt for tuition, an astronomical sum, stamped paid in full from Naomi's personal bank account. Attached to the application was a USB drive labeled audition tapes. The camera, the tripod. She hadn't been filming me for social media. She had been documenting my progress, compiling an audition reel to prove to the conservative board of directors that a girl with no formal background had the raw talent to deserve a spot in their school. Beneath my application was another, older file. The paper was yellowed. I opened it and stopped breathing. State orphanage intake form. Name, Naomi. Date of admission, 15 years ago. Attached were adoption papers signed by 2 retired ballet instructors. Naomi had not been born into this world of porcelain and silk. She had been forged in the same muddy, desperate hell I came from. She had been a stray, too. She had built her perfection from the ground up to survive. I sank to the floor, clutching the papers to my chest. The truth broke me completely. She wasn't a saint pitying a sinner. She was a survivor reaching back into the fire to pull another one out. I brought her home 3 days later. Her arm was encased in a heavy white cast, secured by a sling. She looked exhausted, the sharp lines of her face softened by painkillers and fatigue. I helped her sit on the sofa, placing a pillow behind her back. I walked to the coffee table and set the manila folder down. She looked at the folder, then up at me. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't offer an excuse. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. My voice was stripped of all its usual armor, raw and unsteady. Why did you let me believe you were just using me? Why did you let me hate you? Naomi leaned her head back, staring at the ceiling. Because you needed an enemy to keep fighting, she said quietly. If I had told you I was just like you would have looked for the catch. You trust anger, Violet. You don't trust kindness. I needed you to stay in the studio, even if it was just to spite me. She turned her head to look at me, her dark eyes entirely unguarded. When I saw you in that alley fighting for your life, I saw myself. The anger, the thorns. I had teachers who saved my life. I just wanted to pass the grace forward. I wanted to give you a weapon that wasn't a fist. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, spilled over my eyelashes. I dropped to my knees beside the sofa. I carefully, gently rested my forehead against her uninjured knee. I cried for the first time since I was a child. I wept for the years I spent fighting ghosts, for the ruined tutu, for the bone that cracked to save my life. Naomi reached out with her good hand. She rested her fingers gently on my hair. It was a silent, absolute forgiveness. The dynamic shifted. The apartment was no longer a museum. It was a sanctuary we shared. I became the caretaker. I cooked the meals. I helped her navigate the painful, frustrating early stages of physical therapy. But mostly I danced. We returned to the studio. With her arm in a sling, Naomi could no longer demonstrate the moves. She sat in a chair at the front of the room. I stood at the bar. I trained with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. The pain in my muscles was no longer a punishment. It was a chisel, carving out the future she had bought for me with her own blood. "Pull up from the center," she would instruct, her voice carrying the same quiet authority, but now I heard the underlying support. "Do not let the ground pull you down." I leaped higher. I spun faster. Whenever my body wanted to give out, whenever the old urge to quit crept into my mind, I looked at the white cast on her arm. I poured every ounce of my gratitude, my guilt, and my fierce loyalty into the movements. We communicated without words. My progress was her healing. Her presence was my anchor. We were rebuilding each other, piece by piece. A year later, the backstage of the National Conservatory Theater smelled of hairspray, rosin, and nervous sweat. I stood in the wings, adjusting the straps of my black tutu. My heart battered against my ribcage like a trapped bird. This was the final showcase, the performance that would determine my placement in a professional company. I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. I turned. Naomi stood there. Her arm was fully healed, though a faint surgical scar remained near her elbow. She had transitioned fully into choreography, her brilliant mind shaping the dances her body could no longer endure at an elite level. She wore a simple black dress, looking every bit the elegant force she had always been. "Breathe," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "What if I mess up the grand jeté?" I whispered, my old insecurities flaring up under the pressure. Naomi smiled, a rare, full, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She reached out and firmly grasped my hands. "You survived the streets. You survived your own anger. You will survive a jump. The stage is just wood and light. Command it." The stage manager whispered my cue. I looked at Naomi one last time. I drew a deep breath, dropped my shoulders, and stepped out of the shadows and into the glaring, blinding spotlight. I didn't dance for the judges in the front row. I danced for the woman standing in the wings. Every extension, every rotation, every leap was a testament to the shield she had been for me. I poured my past into the performance. The mud, the rain, the fear, and the ultimate, sweeping salvation of finding someone who refused to let me fall. The final note of the orchestra swelled and cut off sharply. I struck my final pose, kneeling on the floor, head bowed, chest heaving. For 2 seconds, there was absolute silence in the massive auditorium. Then the applause erupted. It was a physical wave of sound, deafening and overwhelming. The crowd rose to their feet. I stood up, shaking, and bowed deeply. But my eyes immediately darted to the right wing. Naomi was standing there. Tears were streaming down her face, catching the stray beams of the stage lights. She nodded at me, a slow, profound acknowledgement of our shared victory. I ran off the stage the moment the curtain dropped. Other dancers, or the instructors rushing to congratulate me. I found Naomi and wrapped my arms around her in a crushing, desperate hug. She hugged me back with equal force, burying her face in my shoulder. "I did it." I sobbed into her neck. "We did it," she corrected me, her voice thick with emotion. "I always knew you could." In that embrace, the last remnants of the stray street girl vanished. I was whole. The broken bone, the shattered tripod, the misunderstandings, they were the fire that forged this unbreakable bond. She had given me a life, and in return, I had carried her legacy onto the stage. 2 years later, the neighborhood was rough, the brick buildings heavily graffitied. It looked exactly like the place where Naomi had first found me. But inside the converted warehouse, the floors were smooth pine, and the walls were lined with pristine mirrors. I stood at the front of the room, clapping my hands to get the attention of 12 teenage girls. They wore mismatched workout clothes. They had bruised knuckles, defensive postures, and eyes that trusted absolutely no one. I recognized every single look. "First position," I called out, my voice steady, echoing in the large space. The girls hesitantly shuffled their feet, mimicking the stance. I walked down the line, gently adjusting a shoulder here, a chin there. I didn't yell. I didn't show pity. I showed them discipline. I glanced toward the entrance. Naomi stood by the door, holding a clipboard, organizing the funding grants that kept our nonprofit studio running. She caught my eye and offered a subtle, proud smile. The scent of gardenias lingered in the air, a permanent fixture in our shared space. We had built this sanctuary together, a place where girls who were told they were nothing but dirt could learn how to fly. We understood that true salvation isn't just about pulling someone out of the dark, It's about standing shoulder to shoulder with them until they can see the light for themselves. I turned back to the girls, my chosen family, my responsibility. Again, I said, offering my hand to a girl who had stumbled. We try again. Together. The truest power we possess is not the ability to endure suffering alone, but the fierce, relentless choice to reach back into the fire and pull another woman out. I looked at Naomi, and I knew we would never stop reaching.